He'd been working for the same construction company for 25 years. Hard hat, work clothes, every shift starting at 6 a.m. sharp. Nobody wondered why Mike Sullivan seemed worried when they built certain buildings. Until that day, when he recognized a familiar surveillance pattern in the New York skyscraper they were constructing. Because Mike wasn't just a construction worker, he was a CIA agent who had worked on the most classified counterterrorism operations. Welcome to Hidden Warriors. Before we tell you the story of the construction worker who stopped history from repeating itself, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the guardians who protect us from threats we never see coming. The Manhattan Construction Company building site looked like every other high-rise project in New York City. Steel beams reaching toward the sky, concrete trucks lined up, hard hats moving in organized chaos. But Mike Sullivan moved differently than the other workers. At 57, he still had the build of someone who'd spent decades doing physical labor, but his eyes held something else. The cautious awareness of someone who'd learned to see threats others missed. Mike had been with Manhattan Construction for 25 years, ever since he'd left government consulting in 1998. He was a reliable foreman, respected by his crew, trusted by management. He showed up early, stayed late, and treated every project like lives depended on getting it right. Because in his previous career, lives had depended on getting it right. The other workers knew Mike was different. He had habits that didn't quite fit the typical construction profile. He memorized building blueprints like they were tactical maps. He noticed security cameras, access points, and structural vulnerabilities with an attention to detail that went beyond building codes. When federal agents occasionally visited construction sites for routine inspections, Mike would quietly position himself where he could observe their interactions. The small apartment in Queens was sparse, functional, a bed, a kitchenette, and a locked safe that contained documents Mike hadn't looked at in 25 years. Inside that safe was a different life, CIA credentials, commendations from operations that were still classified, and psychological evaluation reports that recommended extended leave after operational burnout. Michael Patrick Sullivan had been Senior Operations Officer, Michael Sullivan, Central Intelligence Agency, Counterterrorism Center. 15 years of hunting the kind of people who made 9/11 possible. 15 years of being too late, too slow, or just missing the critical piece of intelligence that could have prevented attacks that killed thousands. September 11th, 2023, the 22nd anniversary. Mike always worked on September 11th. He'd requested it every year since 2001. While others attended memorial services, Mike channeled his grief into honest labor, building something instead of destroying. The team was working on the 63rd floor of the new Meridian Tower, a mixed-use building that would house offices, residential units, and retail space. Standard Manhattan development, nothing unusual about the project. But as Mike supervised the installation of security infrastructure, something caught his attention. The security camera positioning was wrong. Not wrong for a commercial building, wrong for legitimate security purposes. The angles were designed for surveillance, not protection. Someone had modified the original security plans to create blind spots in certain areas while providing perfect coverage of others. Mike studied the blueprints during his lunch break, cross-referencing them with the actual installations. What he found made his blood run cold. The camera network wasn't designed to protect the building's occupants. It was designed to monitor specific floors, specific offices, specific movements. This was intelligence gathering, not security. But it was the access card system that confirmed his worst fears. The building's key card network had been designed with administrative overrides that could be triggered remotely. Someone could lock down entire floors, trap people in elevators, or disable emergency systems from outside the building. Mike had seen this pattern before. In Langley briefing rooms, in classified reports about failed operations, in the nightmares that had driven him to early retirement. This wasn't just surveillance. This was preparation for an attack. Mike spent the next 3 days conducting his own investigation. He used skills he'd hoped never to need again: human intelligence gathering, pattern analysis, operational security assessment. What he discovered was a conspiracy that reached into every level of the building's construction and management. The security modifications had been ordered by a shell company that traced back to a network of organizations Mike recognized from his CIA days. Not the same groups responsible for 9/11, but inspired by them, funded by some of the same sources, and following a similar operational playbook. The target wasn't just the Meridian Tower. The building was designed to house the Northeast Regional Counterterrorism Center, a joint FBI-CIA facility that would coordinate intelligence operations across 6 states. Taking out that facility would cripple America's counterterrorism capabilities for years. But the attack plan was more sophisticated than flying planes into buildings. The conspirators had spent 5 years infiltrating the construction project, the security company, and the building management firm. On opening day, they would have remote access to every system in the building: elevators, fire suppression, emergency exits, communications. The plan was to trap the counterterrorism personnel inside the building, then use the modified security systems to hunt them down floor by floor. It would be broadcast live, a propaganda victory that would make 9/11 look like a warning shot. Mike faced the same choice he'd faced dozens of times during his CIA career. He could report what he'd found through official channels: FBI, local police, building management. But that would take time, require evidence, involve bureaucrats who might not understand the urgency. Or he could do what he'd done in Kandahar, in Beirut, in a dozen other places where American lives hung in the balance. He could act. Mike's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He couldn't stop the conspiracy. It was too large, too well-funded, too deeply embedded. But he could sabotage their operational capabilities from the inside. Working night shifts when the building was mostly empty, Mike began systematically altering the security installations. He rerouted cables, modified circuit boards, and installed hardware that would give building security control over systems the conspirators thought they owned. The most critical modification was to the building's emergency systems. Mike installed manual overrides that couldn't be triggered remotely, hardwired communication systems that bypassed the compromised network, and created safe rooms that the attackers wouldn't know existed. But Mike's most important sabotage was human intelligence. Using his construction access, he identified every conspirator embedded in the project: the security technician who'd installed the modified cameras, the building manager who'd approved the access card system, the electrical contractor who'd created the remote overrides. Mike documented everything: photographs, video recordings, financial records he'd acquired through methods he'd learned at CIA. Then he created multiple copies, hidden in locations throughout the building that only someone with his construction knowledge would know to look for. The final phase of Mike's operation required him to reveal himself. On September 8th, 3 days before the planned attack, Mike made a call to a number he'd memorized 25 years earlier, but never forgotten. "Counterterrorism Center. How may I direct your call?" "This is Senior Operations Officer Michael Sullivan, employee number 47,291. I need to speak with the Deputy Director. Tell him it's about September 11th. The emergency meeting took place in a conference room Mike hadn't seen in 25 years. Same fluorescent lights, same steel furniture, same maps of global threat assessments covering every wall. But the faces around the table were younger, the technology more advanced, the weight of responsibility just as heavy. Deputy Director Sarah Chen had read Mike's file before the meeting. "Agent Sullivan, Your report describes a conspiracy to attack a facility that doesn't officially exist yet. How did you acquire this intelligence? Mike spread construction blueprints across the table alongside classified schematics that showed the building's true purpose. I've been working construction on the Meridian Tower for 18 months. Someone modified our security systems to facilitate an attack on your facility. The room went quiet as Mike walked them through his evidence. Camera angles that provided surveillance, not security. Access systems designed for remote infiltration. Emergency systems that could be disabled from outside the building. This is exactly what we would have done in Kandahar when we wanted to take down a target from the inside, Mike continued. Infiltrate the construction, compromise the systems, control the environment on attack day. Agent Chen studied the evidence for several minutes. If you're right about this, why didn't you report it through FBI channels? Mike looked around the room at faces that were too young to remember. September 11th, too inexperienced to understand how close America had come to losing everything. Because 22 years ago, we had intelligence about hijacker training, suspicious flight school activities, and unusual surveillance of government buildings. We had protocols, procedures, official channels, and 3,000 people died while we followed those protocols. So you took matters into your own hands. I did what I was trained to do. I protected American lives using whatever means necessary. The counterterrorism operation that followed was one of the most successful in CIA history and one of the most classified. Over the next 72 hours, federal agents arrested 43 conspirators across 6 states. They seized weapons, explosives, and communication equipment that would have coordinated the largest terrorist attack on American soil since 9/11. The Meridian Tower opened on schedule, but as a purely commercial building. The Northeast Regional Counterterrorism Center was relocated to a facility with security designed by people who understood that the greatest threats often come from the inside. Mike Sullivan went back to construction work. He showed up early, stayed late, and treated every project like lives depended on getting it right. But something had changed. For the first time in 25 years, Mike felt like he'd made the right choice at the right time. The nightmares that had driven him from CIA service began to fade. The weight of 9/11s, the feeling that he should have seen it coming, should have connected the dots, should have prevented it, finally began to lift. Director Chen visited Mike 6 months later, not at CIA headquarters, but at a construction site in Brooklyn, where Mike was supervising the installation of emergency systems in a new hospital. "The president wanted me to thank you personally," she said. "What you prevented, it would have been worse than 9/11. Mike adjusted his hard hat and looked up at the building they were constructing. "Director, I spent 15 years at CIA trying to stop attacks after they were already planned. Sometimes the best intelligence work happens when you're close enough to touch the threat with your own hands." The Manhattan Construction Company still has Mike Sullivan on their roster. He's 58 now, still showing up at 6 a.m., still treating every project like lives depend on getting it right. Because sometimes they do. And sometimes the best counterterrorism agents aren't the ones sitting in conference rooms analyzing intelligence reports. Sometimes they're the ones wearing hard hats, carrying lunch pails, and building the America that terrorists want to destroy. Mike Sullivan couldn't prevent 9/11, but he made sure there would never be a 9/11 Part 2. Because that's what hidden warriors do. They serve in silence, work without recognition, and stand guard in places where others would never think to look for danger.